Apache woman sneaks into Cowboy's bed to warm up, and what he saw made his heart stop. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The wind had been rising all evening, scraping across the wide Wyoming flats and pushing through the cracks in Calder Boone's cabin walls. The place was old, built before the war, with gaps that no amount of mud chinking could ever quite seal. By now, he was used to the sound. It had been 3 winters since he bought the land and took to living mostly alone. Most nights he sat at the table, mended tack, smoked, or read by the lantern until his eyes burned, but tonight he had turned in early. The sky had been heavy with clouds at sundown, and he'd known the temperature would drop hard after dark. Calder lay stretched out on the cot against the far wall, one arm behind his head, the other hanging over the edge with his fingers near the rifle stock leaning within easy reach. His hat rested over his face, but his eyes weren't shut. They rarely were this early in the night. Sleep never came easy. The war had left him like that, too light a sleeper, too ready to wake at every sound. Years ago, in Tennessee, it had saved his life more than once. These days, it just kept him company in a cabin that was too quiet when the wind died. He was 39 years old, worn lean from long days and lean winters. The faint blue of his cavalry coat had faded near gray now, frayed at the cuffs where he'd patched them more than once. His boots were by the door, his revolver always hung on the peg beside it, never out of arm's reach. Life here was simple. Fix the fences, tend to the cattle, ride the line once a week, trade for supplies when he had to. He didn't expect trouble. He didn't expect company either, not this far from town. That's why the sound made him sit up fast. It was small at first, just a faint scuff of feet outside the door, but it wasn't the wind. He knew the difference between wind and weight. He held still, every muscle tensed, listening. The sound came again, the soft groan of the porch plank. Calder swung his legs over the side of the cot, hand closing around the rifle. He didn't raise it yet, just rested the barrel across his knees and waited. The latch didn't rattle. The door didn't slam open. Instead, there was a pause, long enough for him to hear the wind die down, and then the softest creak as the door gave way. Someone was inside. He was on his feet now, bare toes pressing into the cold floor. "Who's there?" No answer. He stepped forward just enough to reach the lantern on the table, striking a match with a sharp hiss. Light spilled into the room, throwing long shadows against the walls. That was when he heard the cot creak behind him. He turned sharply, rifle half raised, and saw the shape under the blanket. Someone, no, not someone, a woman, had slipped into his bed in the space of a heartbeat. She was curled tight on the far edge, her back to the wall, like a cornered animal. Calder's pulse jumped. "Get out of there," he said, voice low but hard. The woman flinched but didn't move. The light caught her face now, bronze-skinned, young, no more than 24 by his guess. Apache, by the long black hair falling wild around her shoulders, by the sharp cut of her cheekbones. She was barefoot. Her feet were raw and blistered, one ankle swollen. Her dress, if you could call it that anymore, was ripped down the front, hanging loose enough to show the deep line of her chest and the dirt streaked across her collarbone. The skirt was torn high up her thigh, and dried blood had darkened the hem. She smelled of smoke and sweat, like she had been running for days. For a second, Calder's gut reaction was to haul her up and throw her back outside. This was his place, his cot, his one space in the world that belonged to him alone. He couldn't have strangers walking in and climbing under his blanket like they owned it. But she didn't speak, didn't beg, didn't even try to hide herself. She just looked at him with wide, dark eyes, not pleading, not defiant, just waiting for what he'd do next. And that was what stopped him. If she had begged, he could have hardened himself and said no. If she had lied, he could have turned cold. But she didn't. She just waited, quiet and tense, shoulders bunched like she'd bolt if he so much as stepped too fast toward her. Calder cursed under his breath, lowering the rifle. He crossed to the chair by the wall and grabbed the extra wool blanket, tossed it toward her with a motion sharper than he meant it to be. "You stay there," he said gruffly. "Don't touch me." She caught it, slow, her fingers trembling, then pulled it around herself and curled tighter against the wall. Calder turned back to the table, blew out the match, and let the lantern burn low. He sat on the edge of the cot with his rifle across his knees for a long time, staring at the fireless stove, listening to the wind and to her breathing. It wasn't fear he felt now. It was something harder to name. She was trouble. That much he knew. No one showed up like this without a story that could bring more men to his door. He could tell her to leave at dawn, wash his hands of her, and go back to the quiet that had kept him alive this long. But the memory of her bare, cracked feet and the bruises on her arms wouldn't leave him alone. Whatever she was running from had already stripped her down to bone and desperation, and he couldn't quite bring himself to be the one to finish the job. When he finally lay back down, it was with the rifle still close to his hand and every sense tuned sharp, listening to every breath she took until the wind drowned them both out. Sleep didn't come easy, and for the first time in years, Calder Boone wasn't sure he wanted it to. Morning came gray and bitter, the kind of light that made everything look colder. Calder woke before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, as he always did. Habit. His eyes went first to the far edge of the cot. She was still there, a small shape under the blanket. Her dark hair spilled out in messy ropes across her face. For a moment, he thought maybe she'd slipped out in the night. But then she stirred, a faint sound leaving her throat as she tucked the blanket tighter. Calder swung his legs over the side of the cot and stood, joints stiff from a night spent half awake. He went to the stove, stirred the ashes, and got a small flame going before pulling down the tin coffee pot. The familiar sound of water hitting metal filled the silence, grounding him. He needed normal. When the smell of coffee spread through the room, she sat up slowly, still clutching the blanket around her shoulders. Her eyes found him immediately, alert but not panicked. "You're still here," he said, more to himself than to her. She didn't answer. Calder poured 2 cups, set one down on the table closest to where she sat, then took his own to the chair. "It's hot," he said. She hesitated, then unwrapped herself just enough to crawl toward the cup. Her feet touched the floor, and he saw her wince. Up close, her soles were split and bruised, some cuts deep enough to bleed again when she stepped. "Sit back down," he said, sharper than he meant to. "You'll tear them worse." She froze, then lowered herself back onto the blanket. Calder let out a slow breath, set his own cup down, and got up. He rummaged in the chest by the wall until he found the small tin of salve he used for saddle sores and burns. He crouched near her, set the tin down between them, and nodded at her feet. "Hold still." She didn't move at first, just watched him with that same sharp, unreadable stare. But then she shifted, pulling her feet out from under the blanket. Calder worked in silence, dabbing the salve over the worst cuts, wrapping them with clean strips of cloth he tore from an old shirt. Her skin was cold under his hands, cold enough he could feel it through the calluses on his fingers. When he was done, he stood and put the tin away. "You'll stay inside today," he said. "Let them heal." Still no answer, but she didn't look away. Calder made a pot of beans and set a bowl in front of her. She ate slowly at first, like she wasn't sure it was meant for her, then faster once she realized he wasn't going to take it away. When she finished, she pushed the bowl back toward him and said quietly, "Naya." Calder looked at her. "My name," she added, touching her chest. He nodded once. "Calder." She repeated it under her breath, like she was testing the sound. The rest of the day passed in uneasy quiet. Calder went outside to check the stock, hammer loose boards back into place on the barn door, and cut more wood. Each time he came back, she was there, first sitting near the fire, later crouched on the floor with his mending kit. She had found the tear in her dress and was sewing it shut with careful, clumsy stitches. Calder leaned against the doorframe for a moment, watching. The split bodice was closed now, though it still gaped low enough to show the edge of her collarbone. Mud had flaked off her skin, leaving faint streaks like war paint on her arms. "Where'd you come from?" he asked finally. She didn't look up. "South," she said after a long pause. The word careful, accented but clear. "Anyone following you?" Her needle stopped midair. She gave one small nod. Calder felt the tightness in his gut settle deeper. Trouble just like he thought. "You can stay for now," he said slowly. "But if they come, you do what I tell you. Understand?" She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once. That night, Calder left the cot to her and made himself a place on the floor near the door, rifle within arm's reach. He didn't trust her yet, not fully, but he couldn't put her back out in the cold either, not with feet that raw and men possibly behind her. When he lay down, he could hear her breathing steady and even under the blanket, and against his better judgment, he felt some of the tension in his chest ease. For the first time since the war, the cabin didn't feel quite as empty. The wind eased overnight, leaving behind a hard chill and a pale sky when Calder rose the next morning. He moved quietly so as not to wake her, stoked the stove, and stepped outside with his coffee to scan the horizon. The yard was empty except for the cattle huddled near the fence line. No dust trails, no riders. For now, it was just them. When he came back in, Naya was sitting up on the cot, the blanket around her shoulders. She had gathered her hair into a rough braid and looked a little less like a shadow this morning. Her feet were still bandaged, but she had managed to wash the worst of the dirt from her arms and face using the basin near the door. "You can use more water if you need it," Calder said, nodding toward the bucket. She glanced at him, then poured a little into her hands and rubbed at her neck and collarbone. Her skin was tanned and marked with faint bruises that were beginning to yellow. He looked away, busying himself with the pot of beans left from last night, but the image stayed with him. After breakfast, he checked her feet again. The cuts were closing, but still raw. "You can walk short," he said. "Not far." She nodded and, to his surprise, started helping him with the day's chores. At first, she limped heavily, but she refused to sit down. She carried kindling to the stove, swept the floor with a short broom she found by the wall, and stacked the few clean dishes neatly by the basin. Calder watched her for a while, hammer still in his hand from fixing the loose hinge on the door. "You've done this before," he said finally. She looked at him. "Work? Keeping a place," he clarified. Her mouth tightened. "Family gone," she said simply, then turned back to what she was doing. That was all she offered, but it was more than she had given him before. Calder felt something shift in him at those words. Whatever she was running from hadn't just bruised her and left her barefoot. It had taken everyone she had. Later, when the sun was higher, she crouched by the fire sewing again. This time it wasn't her dress, but one of his shirts, patching a tear in the sleeve where barbed wire had caught a weeks back. Calder stood in the doorway watching her hands move. Her stitches were uneven but steady, and she frowned each time the needle stuck. He found himself asking, "You know how to use a needle and thread well enough?" She shrugged. "Mother teach me." "Not good," she admitted, holding up the crooked seam. "It'll hold," Calder said, surprising himself by almost smiling. The day went on like that, quiet, but not the strained quiet of before. She began to move around the cabin like she belonged there, even if she never went far from the fire. Toward evening, Calder saddled the horse to check the northern fence line. Naya stood in the doorway watching him. "You stay inside," he said. "Door barred till I come back." She frowned slightly, then nodded. When he returned an hour later, the lantern was lit and the door was bolted just like he told her. She unbarred it when she heard his voice and stepped back so he could enter. There was a small pot of beans warming on the stove. She had fed the fire without being asked. They ate together at the table, not speaking much, but each passing the salt and the bread without hesitation. It felt different. Afterward, Calder took out his rifle and began cleaning it on the table. Naya sat cross-legged on the floor watching him, her face calm. After a while, she asked, "Men come?" "Not today," Calder said. "But if they do, I'll know it." She nodded once, then was quiet for a long time. "Why do they want you?" Calder asked finally, his tone even. Her eyes flicked up to meet his. "Not want me," she said. "Want take back." "Tribe," he asked. She hesitated, then shook her head. "White men. Not my people." That explained the fear in her eyes the night she'd slipped under his blanket. Explained why she hadn't gone back south. "You stay here until your feet heal," Calder said firmly. "We'll figure the rest after." Something eased in her shoulders at that. She pulled the blanket around herself and sat closer to the stove, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Calder saw the faintest curve of a smile at the corner of her mouth. Later, When he banked the fire, she didn't climb into the cot right away but stayed near the warm coals, sewing until her eyes grew heavy. When she finally lay down, she didn't curl as far from him as before. Calder lay awake listening to the wind and the soft sound of her breathing. For a man who had spent the last few years with only cattle and silence for company, it was a strange thing to have another person filling the cabin. But it no longer felt like an intrusion. It felt like the beginning of something he wasn't ready to name. The next day dawned bright but biting cold, frost glazing the troughs and the low grass outside. Calder rose early, as always, and found Naya already awake, sitting on the edge of the cot with the blanket around her shoulders. She had been watching the fire burn down to embers, eyes distant. "You sleep?" Calder asked, pulling on his boots. She shrugged one shoulder, then looked up at him. "Enough," she said, voice low but steadier than before. He nodded and busied himself with coffee. As it boiled, he brought out his small supply of jerky and set some on the table with the last of the bread. She joined him without being asked, sitting opposite him this time instead of keeping her distance. The shift was small, but Calder noticed. After breakfast, he checked her feet again. The cuts were closing nicely, the swelling almost gone. "You'll walk better today," he said, rewrapping the cloth. She gave a faint smile. "Good," she said. They spent the morning working in silence. Calder split wood outside, while Naya gathered the smaller pieces into a neat pile by the stove. When he came back in, he found her wiping the table with a damp rag, then rearranging the few tools and supplies on the shelves. She wasn't just passing time now. She was ordering the space, making it hers in some small way. At midday, Calder saddled the horse and gestured to her. "Ride with me. Slow, just the south pasture." She hesitated, then nodded and followed him outside. He lifted her up onto the horse behind the saddle, careful of her feet, and they rode out under a pale blue sky. The wind was cold, but she sat straight, holding the back of his coat lightly. Calder used the ride to check the fence line, stopping once to tighten a loose wire. Naya stayed quiet, scanning the horizon like she had been trained to watch for movement. When they turned back toward the cabin, she asked, "No men?" "Not today," he said. She seemed to relax slightly, her hands loosening on his coat. Back at the cabin, she helped him unsaddle the horse, carrying the blanket to the fence rail and shaking the dust from it. Her movements were sure now, less guarded, and Calder found himself watching her longer than he should have. That evening, after supper, the cabin was warm from the fire and smelled faintly of beans and wood smoke. Calder sat at the table, cleaning his revolver, the task so familiar it let his mind wander. He thought of how she had sat the horse that afternoon, how she had looked around the yard like she was memorizing every inch of it. He had half expected her to bolt the first day she could walk, but she hadn't. She was still here. When he put the revolver away and turned, he found her sitting on the cot, knees drawn up, watching him. "You should be by the fire," he said, surprised. She shook her head slowly. "Not cold." Calder stood there for a long moment before crossing the room and sitting on the edge of the cot. The air between them felt charged, quiet but full. "You planning to stay?" he asked finally. Naya looked at the floor for a long time before meeting his eyes. "If can," she said simply. Calder let out a slow breath. Something in him eased at those words. "Then you stay," he said. The corner of her mouth lifted slightly, the closest thing to a smile he had seen on her face since she arrived. She shifted closer, still careful, as if waiting for him to tell her to stop. Calder didn't. When her head came to rest against his shoulder, he sat still, letting her stay there. The fire popped in the stove, and the wind outside rattled the shutters. But for once Calder didn't feel the old pull of tension in his chest. When she finally moved away to lie down, he didn't take the cot for himself, but stayed sitting there until she was asleep, listening to the soft sound of her breathing. Later, he banked the fire and lay down beside her, leaving a respectful space between them, but close enough to feel the warmth of another body. Sleep came easier that night, and for the first time since she had arrived, Calder didn't dream of war or empty rooms. The thaw came slowly that week, with days that were just warm enough to turn the ground soft and nights that still froze it solid again. The cabin smelled of damp earth and smoke, and Calder kept the fire going longer than usual to chase the chill away. Each morning, he found Naya already awake, sitting near the stove with the blanket around her shoulders, hair loose down her back. She had begun to move with purpose now, no longer waiting for him to tell her what needed doing. She swept the floor, aired out the bedding, and stacked kindling before he even put his boots on. One morning, while she was wringing out the rag she'd used to wipe the table, Calder caught himself just watching her. The curve of her back, the way her hair swung as she bent forward. He turned away quickly, pulling on his coat and stepping outside to clear his head. The yard was wet, mud clinging to his boots as he walked the fence line. Each post he checked reminded him that the world outside this cabin hadn't changed. There were still men out there who might be looking for her. And if they came, it would be his fight too. When he came back in, she was crouched by the fire, sewing a patch onto the knee of his work pants. She looked up at him, and for the first time he saw no fear in her face. "You were too much," she said quietly. He gave a short grunt that might have been a laugh. "Somebody has to." Her lips curved slightly, then she went back to stitching. That night, after supper, Calder sat sharpening his knife while Naya brushed out her hair by the fire. She had washed it earlier, and it hung damp and shining down her back. The cabin felt too quiet. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked suddenly, the word surprising even him. Naya's hand stilled. She turned her head to look at him. "Where go?" "Back south. Maybe find what's left of your people." Her gaze dropped to the floor. "No one left," she said softly. "All gone." Calder set the knife aside. "Then you stay here until you decide different," he said. She nodded once, as if that was enough, and went back to combing through the ends of her hair. When it was time to bank the fire, Calder hesitated before spreading out his bedroll on the floor. He had been giving her the cot every night since she arrived, but something about the way she had looked at him just now made him stop. "You can take the cot," he said finally, motioning toward it. Naya shook her head slowly, then did something she hadn't done before. She stood, crossed the cot, and sat down on one side, leaving space for him. Calder stayed where he was for a long moment. Then he blew out the lantern, set his revolver within reach, and crossed the room. He lay down on his side of the cot, careful not to touch her. The space between them felt charged, the air too warm despite the cold seeping through the cabin walls. After a while, Naya shifted under the blanket, turning toward him. Her hand brushed against his arm, light as breath. Calder's heart thudded hard in his chest, but he didn't pull away. "You safe," she whispered, the words so quiet he almost didn't catch them. Calder turned his head toward her, seeing her eyes in the faint glow from the stove. "You too," he said simply. They lay like that a long time, the silence between them no longer strained, but full of something he hadn't felt in years. When he finally slept, it was deep and dreamless, and when he woke near dawn, she was still there, curled close enough that their shoulders touched under the blanket. The day started quietly. Calder chopped wood while Naya boiled coffee, and neither mentioned what had happened. But when night came again, she didn't wait for him to offer. She sat on the cot, as if it was decided, and this time when they lay down, she didn't keep that small gap between them. Calder let his arm rest across her waist, slow and careful, ready to pull back if she stiffened. She didn't. Instead, she shifted closer, her forehead brushing his chest. For a man who had spent so long with nothing but his own thoughts for company, the simple weight of her against him felt like something he hadn't known he needed. Outside, the wind rose again, rattling the shutters, but inside the cabin there was only the crackle of the fire and the steady sound of her breathing. And for the first time, Calder didn't think about the men who might come down the trail or the years he had lost to grief. He thought about the fact that she was here and she was choosing to stay. The next days settled into something that almost felt like rhythm. Calder worked the pasture fences, cut and stacked wood, and checked the cattle each morning while Naya kept the cabin warm, kept the meals simple but steady, and mended whatever needed fixing. When he came in from the cold, she was always there, quiet but present, moving with purpose. Calder didn't say much about her sharing the cot now. It had simply become what they did. At night, when the fire burned low and the wind pressed against the shutters, she lay close enough that he could feel her breathing. Sometimes he woke before dawn and found her hair across his shoulder, her hand near his chest. He no longer pulled back. One evening, after a day spent hauling brush from the creek bed, Calder came in tired and sore, his shoulders stiff. Naya was sitting by the stove, brushing out her hair. The cabin smelled faintly of stew and pine smoke. "You eat," she said simply, nodding toward the bowl on the table. He did, silently, his eyes on her as she worked the brush through the last tangle. Her hair was longer than he realized, reaching almost to her waist now that it was clean and straight. The lamplight caught the bronze of her skin, and the neckline of her mended dress still hung loose enough to show the smooth line of her collarbone. After he finished eating, he sat down on the floor near the fire to clean the mud from his boots. Naya set her brush aside and joined him, sitting cross-legged opposite him. "You quiet tonight," she said after a moment. "Just thinking," Calder answered. "What thing?" He hesitated, then said, "About what I'd do if those men showed up again." Her face tightened. "They come back." "Not yet," Calder said, shaking his head. "But if they do, I'll be ready." She was silent for a long moment, then asked, "You fight for me?" He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the question in her eyes wasn't just about rifles and danger. It was about whether she could truly trust him. "I will," he said simply. Something shifted in her expression, then something that looked like relief. She moved a little closer to the fire, the heat catching on her skin. "Why stay?" Calder asked quietly. "You could try for the town, or head west. No one would stop you now." She shook her head. "Town knows safe," she said. "West knows safe. Here's safe." Her gaze held as steadily as she said it, as if making it clear that this was not just the safe place she had found. It was the safe place she had chosen. Calder let out a slow breath. He hadn't realized how much he'd wanted to hear her say that until just now. The fire popped loudly, and the room seemed suddenly too quiet. Naya shifted closer still, close enough that the edge of her knee brushed against his. Calder didn't move away. She reached out, then hesitated and touched the back of his hand lightly. Calder's fingers curled instinctively, and before he could think better of it, he turned his hand over and caught hers gently. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The fire crackled, the wind moaned against the shutters, and Calder's heartbeat thudded hard in his ears. Then Naya leaned forward and kissed him. It wasn't hurried, wasn't shy either, just soft and sure, tasting of smoke and the stew they had just eaten. Calder froze for half a second before his hand came up to her cheek, rough palm warm against her skin. When she drew back, her breathing was quick, and her dark eyes searched his face like she was waiting for him to push her away. He didn't. Instead, he kissed her back, slower this time, careful and steady, until she relaxed under his touch. When they finally parted, Calder rested his forehead against hers and let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "You should sleep," he said quietly, though his voice was rougher than usual. Naya nodded, still close enough that her hair brushed against his jaw. They banked the fire together and lay down on the cot, and this time Calder didn't just leave space between them. He drew her in, letting her settle against him with his arm across her waist. She stayed there without hesitation, her hand resting lightly on his chest. Calder didn't sleep right away. He stared at the ceiling and the dim glow from the stove, thinking about what had just happened, about the weight of the promise he had made her when he said he'd fight if men came. In the morning, he rode out to check the north pasture. That was when he saw it, a set of tracks, fresh and too deep to be from his own horse. Two riders had passed through recently, heading west. Calder crouched by the tracks for a long time, jaw tight. Someone was still looking. When he returned to the cabin, Naya was tending the fire. She looked up as soon as she saw his face. "Tracks," he said simply. Her fingers tightened on the poker, but she didn't speak. "We'll be ready," Calder said, his tone firm. She gave a single sharp nod, and when he sat down to pull off his gloves, she came to stand near him, her hand brushing his shoulder in a small, wordless gesture that told him she trusted him to keep that promise. That night, when they lay down, there was no hesitation at all. The next morning broke gray and windless, the kind of stillness Calder never trusted. He stood on the porch with his coffee, scanning the horizon while Naya moved inside the cabin, quiet but steady. Her presence had become part of the place now, her braid hanging over her shoulder as she worked, her careful way of setting things back where they belonged. Calder's eyes caught something far down the trail, two faint specks against the pale earth, too far to hear, but coming slow. He stayed there until the shapes grew into riders. His gut tightened. He turned and opened the door. "Naya," he said, voice calm but firm. She appeared instantly, reading his face before he even spoke. "Men." "Yes." "Two." Her hands gripped the edge of the doorframe. "Same." "Could be." For a moment, he expected her to go to the back of the cabin, to hide, but she didn't move. She just nodded once and said, "I stay." Calder held her gaze for a long second, then gave a single nod. "Inside. Bolt the door after me. Don't open unless it's my voice." She obeyed without argument as he stepped out onto the porch. The air felt colder than it had an hour ago, the kind of cold that sat heavy on the skin. Calder stood at the edge of the porch, rifle in hand, watching as the riders came closer. When they reached the gate, they slowed. One of them, the older one, with a trimmed beard and a worn coat, raised a hand in greeting that didn't match the hard look in his eyes. "Morning," the man called. Calder didn't move. "You're a long way from town." The second rider, younger, shifted in his saddle. "Looking for someone. Apache girl, maybe 24. You seen her?" Calder's grip on the rifle stayed steady. "No one here but me." The older man's mouth curved slightly. "Funny. We heard different." Calder's jaw tightened. "You heard wrong." There was a long pause, the wind still dead. Calder could feel the weight of Naya's presence just beyond the door, knew she was listening. "You mind if we look around?" the younger man asked, though it didn't sound much like a question. "I do," Calder said flatly. The two riders exchanged a glance. The older one spat into the dirt. "She stole something. Doesn't belong out here. You're not doing yourself any favors by keeping her." Calder stepped off the porch and leveled the rifle, not aiming to fire, but making it clear he could. "Trail's that way," he said, nodding toward the open plain. "You ride it, or you ride back the way you came. Either way, you leave my place standing." The younger one shifted again, looking like he might argue, but the older man put a hand on his arm. After a long moment, he gave Calder a hard look and turned his horse. "This ain't done," he said over his shoulder. "Then make sure you're ready next time," Calder said. They rode off slow, but Calder kept the rifle raised until there were only specks on the horizon again. Only then did he lower it, his pulse still heavy in his chest. When he opened the cabin door, Naya was standing in the middle of the room, her hands clenched at her sides. "They go?" she asked. "For now," Calder said. She stepped forward and took the rifle from his hands, setting it carefully against the wall. Then, without a word, she wrapped her arms around his middle and pressed her face against his chest. Calder froze for a moment, then let out a long breath and rested one hand on the back of her head. "They'll come again," he said quietly. "I know," she whispered. He held her there until the tightness in both their shoulders eased. When she finally stepped back, her eyes were dry but hard, no longer the eyes of someone ready to run. "I fight too," she said simply. Calder studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. "All right," he said. The rest of the day passed in tense quiet. Calder cleaned the rifle and checked the other ammunition, setting some aside where it could be grabbed fast. Naya moved through the cabin with new purpose, sharpening the kitchen knife on the whetstone and tying her hair back out of her face like she meant to be ready. That night, when they lay down, she didn't just curl near him. She pressed close, seeking not just warmth but something steadier. Calder held her without hesitation this time, his hand tracing the length of her braid as if to promise he wasn't going to let her be taken. Sleep came slow, but when it did, it was the deep kind that comes after a decision has been made. In the morning, Calder saddled the horse early and showed Naya how to load the spare rifle. She listened carefully, her hand sure as she worked the lever. "They come back. You stay inside," Calder said. "But you keep this ready." She nodded, gripping the rifle. When she set it back down, she stepped close to him and kissed him, not like the hesitant kiss by the fire, but with quiet certainty, like she was sealing an unspoken pact. Calder rested his forehead against hers and let himself breathe her in, the smell of smoke and soap and the faint trace of stew still on her hands. When she pulled back, she said only one word, "Stay." "I will," he said, and for the first time, he realized he wanted to fight if it meant keeping her there. The wind picked up the next afternoon, carrying a low hiss through the cottonwoods along the creek. Calder was in the yard stacking wood when he saw them again. Two riders on the same trail, this time coming faster. He went inside, his voice calm but clipped. "They're back." Naya was already standing by the table, the rifle leaning against her chair. Her braid was tight, her face set. She didn't ask what to do. She just nodded, took the rifle, and moved to the corner of the cabin where she could see the door but stay out of sight. Calder stepped back outside and waited. He didn't call to them this time. He let them ride close enough that the dust from their horses settled in the yard. The older man reined up first, face harder than before. "We told you we'd be back," he said. Calder leveled his rifle across his arm. "And I told you to ride on." The younger man shifted in his saddle, his hand near the butt of his pistol. "She's coming with us. You can stand aside, or you can stand in the way." Calder's voice was steady. "She stays here." The moment stretched tight, the wind carrying the horses breathing, the creak of saddle leather. Then the older man swung down from his horse, boots crunching in the dirt. Calder's thumb eased the hammer back on the rifle with a click that cut through the yard like a blade. "Don't," he warned. The man froze, his eyes narrowing. "You'd shoot a man over her?" Calder's jaw tightened. "Try me." For a long moment, no one moved. Then the younger rider swore under his breath and tugged his horse around. "Let's go," he muttered. The older man stared at Calder another second, then spat in the dirt and swung back into the saddle. "You just bought yourself trouble, Boone," he said. Calder didn't answer. He held his aim until they were halfway down the trail, then lowered the rifle and let out the breath he'd been holding. When he stepped back inside, Naya was still standing there, rifle ready. Her hands were steady, but her eyes were wide. "They gone?" she asked. "For now," Calder said. She crossed the room quickly and set the rifle down, then stopped in front of him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she reached up, cupped his face with both hands, and kissed him hard. Calder let the rifle drop against the wall and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. The kiss was urgent this time, full of everything they hadn't said in the last weeks. Fear, relief, the sharp edge of knowing they might not have gotten another chance. When they broke apart, she didn't step back. She stayed close, breathing fast, her hands still on his chest. "They come back?" she asked. "They might," Calder said honestly. Her chin lifted slightly. "Then we stay ready." Calder nodded. "We will." That night, the cabin felt warmer than it ever had, though the fire was no bigger than usual. Naya didn't just share the cot. She climbed into it before Calder had even taken off his boots, holding the blanket open in a wordless invitation. He joined her, lying on his side, facing her. For a long moment, they just looked at each other in the dim light, the crackle of the fire the only sound. Then Calder reached out, tracing his rough fingers along her cheek, down the line of her arm, slow and careful. When she didn't pull away, he kissed her again, slower this time, and she kissed him back with quiet certainty. The rest happened naturally, without words, as if the last weeks of silence had led them here. It was unhurried, gentle, full of the same careful respect he had shown her from the first night he let her stay. When it was over, they stayed close, breathing together in the dark. Calder rested his forehead against hers, his hand over hers on his chest. "You're safe," he said quietly. Naya's lips curved against his shoulder. "With you," she said. Calder closed his eyes and let the words settle in him like something he hadn't known he needed. Outside, the wind died down, leaving the night still. For the first time, the cabin didn't just feel like shelter, it felt like a home. The morning after the riders left, Calder was already outside before the sun cleared the ridge. The ground was cold under his boots, the sky washed pale blue. He walked the fence line with his rifle across his shoulder, eyes scanning the trail. The quiet felt too deep. Inside, Naya had already stoked the fire and set coffee to boil. When Calder stepped back in, she was standing at the table, the rifle close at hand. She looked at him, waiting. "They'll come again," Calder said. She nodded once. "Then we ready." They spent the day preparing. Calder stacked more wood near the cabin, checked every round of ammunition twice, and oiled the rifle until the lever ran smooth. Naya cooked enough beans and bread to last a few days if they couldn't leave the cabin. She was no longer moving like a guest. This was her home now, too, and she defended it with the same focus he did. By late afternoon, the wind had picked up, carrying dust along the trail. Calder saw the riders before they reached the gate, and this time there were 3. He opened the door and spoke just loud enough for her to hear. 3 now. Naya's face didn't change. "I stay." Calder stepped out onto the porch and waited, rifle ready. The men rode straight into the yard this time, not slowing until they were within shouting distance. The bearded one swung down from his horse first, his boots hitting the dirt hard. "This is your last chance, Boone," he said. "Hand her over and we ride out clean." Calder shook his head once. "She stays here." The man's jaw tightened. "Then we'll take her." The younger rider moved to dismount, and that's when Calder fired. The shot hit the dirt close enough to the man's boot to throw up dust. "You try," Calder said, voice flat, "and one of you won't ride home." The man froze, eyes locked on him. The bearded rider's hand hovered near his revolver, but he didn't draw. He looked from Calder to the cabin, where Naya now stood in the doorway, rifle leveled. "She's not yours to take," Calder said. "Ride out and don't come back." For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then the bearded man swore, spat in the dirt, and turned toward his horse. "Come on," he said to the others. "Ain't worth it." They mounted up and rode off, the sound of their hooves fading until the yard was quiet again. Calder stayed where he was until they were out of sight, then lowered the rifle. His shoulders loosened for the first time in days. Naya stepped out onto the porch, rifle still in her hands. Her breathing was fast, but her hands were steady. "They go?" she asked. "They go," Calder said. "For good, I think." She lowered the rifle slowly, then set it against the wall. When she turned to him, her face broke into the first real smile he had seen from her, small but sure. "They not take me," she said. "No," Calder said, stepping closer. "Nobody will." He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face. She leaned into his touch, then wrapped her arms around him. Calder held her there, the quiet around them no longer tense but calm, the kind that meant the danger had passed. That night, they sat on the porch together, watching the sun set over the open land. The sky turned gold, then red, then deep purple as the stars began to show. Calder's arm rested around her shoulders, her head against his chest. "This your home now," he said quietly. Naya nodded, her hand finding his. "Yes," she said. "Home." Inside, the cabin was warm, the fire crackling steady. When they went in, she lit the lantern and moved easily around the room, her movements sure, like someone who belonged there. They shared the cot again, but tonight there was no hesitation, no space left between them. The world outside had been kept at bay, and for the first time since that night she had slipped under his blanket, Calder let himself breathe without expecting the next knock at the door. He kissed her slow before they slept, and she kissed him back, her hand resting over his heart. When morning came, the air was calm, the sky clear. Calder stood outside with his coffee, watching the first light touch the horizon. Behind him, Naya stepped out barefoot, blanket around her shoulders, and came to stand beside him. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The land stretched wide and open before them, and for the first time, it felt like it was theirs.